Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and very warm welcome to the 4th SBI Banking and Economics Conclave 2017. Over the last 3 years, the SBI Banking and Economics Conclave has carved a niche for itself as a boiling pot of new ideas by the biggest newsmakers and leaders of change, a platform for innovative thought and game-changing ideas. And your esteemed presence here this evening only goes further to cement that. In the past, the conclave has hosted dignitaries like Finance Minister Jaitley, Timothy Geithner, Raghuram Rajan, Chanda Kochar, Shikha Sharma, Kumar Mangalam Birla, who's here with us again this evening, and Anand Mahindra, amongst others, and we're very happy to have you with us this evening as well. India is in the midst of a transformational shift, and many in this room are the drivers of that change. It's only pertinent then that the 4th edition of the SBI Banking and Economics Conclave focus on the theme, Pathfinders, a discovery of ways to New India. A new India that is global at heart, reformative in thought, digital in approach, and bold in implementation. So over these 2 days, the conclave hopes to tackle a range of issues, from growth revival to the leadership agenda, the new reality of GST, also India's positioning in the globe, and a special focus on Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh. It certainly promises to be an enriching experience and one that I'm sure you'll want to share. So should you wish to share that on social media, may I request that you use our hashtag SBI Conclave. So to get started then, may I invite Ms. Arundhati Bhattacharya, Chairman, State Bank of India, for a welcome address.
Good evening. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Paul Krugman, all our distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen, for the 4th Banking and Economics Conclave 2017. The SBI Banking and Economics Conclave is the flagship annual event of State Bank of India, a one of its kind in the industry. The conclave has carved a niche for itself by selecting topics that are constructive but provocative, often avoided, and largely unnoticed. Our effort is to create a body of knowledge that provides actionable solutions to contemporary problems facing the country. Therefore, the conclave strives to bring diverse viewpoints, national and international, to deliberate under the overarching theme of the conclave every year. 2017 is a special year in many, many ways. The world has seen dramatic events such as the change of political guard in the US, the rising threat of terrorism in Europe, and ever-changing metrics of economic and social stability in various parts of the globe. India also has its share of milestones in 2017, notably the recent success of ISRO and the launch of GST. Thus, in line with the changing times, the theme of the conclave for this year has been chosen. Unlike the previous 3 conclaves, when we focused on specific issues facing the economy, this year we have set our eyes on the future. Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi has on numerous occasions laid down the vision of a new India. A new India will include the strengths and skills of 125 crore people who, according to him, will create a Bhavya and Divya Bharat, a grand and divine India. However, the most elaborate wording of New India came from his speech in Kerala. A new India will include prosperity and not poverty, equality and not discrimination, justice and not injustice, cleanliness and not impurity, transparency and not corruption, employment and not unemployment, respect to women and not atrocities against women, and hope and not despondency. There are many roads to reaching the final destination of New India. These new routes include Digital India, Make in India, Skill India, Swachh Bharat Mission, Jan Dhan Yojana, financial inclusion, Mudra, ease of doing business, amongst others. All these initiatives are either new ways of organizing a process or improving upon an existing process by innovation using new technology. However, there are many ways that are yet to be discovered. This year's conclave will therefore have the overarching theme, Pathfinders, a discovery of ways to New India. Spread over 2 days, I hope this conclave will be an enriching experience for all. Now, we shall begin today's evening with a keynote address by Professor Paul Krugman. Well, he does not really need any introduction, but still, he is one of the world's foremost economists. Professor Krugman won the 2008 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science for his groundbreaking work on international trade and economic geography. He is the author or editor of 20 books and more than 200 papers in professional journals and edited volumes. Professor Krugman is one of the founders of the New Trade Theory, a major rethinking of the theory of international trade, for which he also received the John Bates Clark Medal in 1991 from the American Economic Association, a prize given every 2 years to that economist under 40 who is adjudged to have made a significant contribution to economic knowledge. He is recognized worldwide as a leader in the fields of economic geography and the role of increasing returns in shaping international trade. The author of several books, Professor Krugman's most recent, End This Depression Now, is a call for action. In it, Professor Krugman has a powerful message for anyone who has suffered during the Great Recession. A quick, strong recovery is just one step away if our leaders can find the intellectual clarity and political will to end this depression now. His previous books include The Conscience of a Liberal, The Great Unraveling, and The Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008, a response to the financial crisis, an updated edition of his 1999 book, The Return of Depression Economics. Currently, Professor Krugman is a professor of economics and distinguished scholar at the Graduate Center's Luxembourg Income Studies Center at City University of New York. Previously, he was a professor of economics at Princeton University. A gifted observer and contributor on policy and economics, Professor Krugman is known to speak the truth as he sees it in the most compelling terms. His twice-weekly op-ed pieces for the New York Times model the depth of insight and the unflinchingly outspoken style he brings to his speeches. Hence, without further delay, I welcome you, sir, to deliver your address.
May I now request Ms. Bhattacharya to please felicitate Mr. Krugman with a traditional shawl and a green certificate. So I'll tell you something that's very interesting. About 2 years ago, State Bank of India did away with the practice of actually giving flower bouquets, and instead they started on a green mission. So what they do is that they plant 101 trees and they actually present that green certificate to the guests who are here. So this green certificate which Ms. Bhattacharya is presenting to Mr. Krugman is not just a token of appreciation, but it's actually a testimony to SBI's commitment to the environment. So without further delay, let me hand the stage to both of you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming to hear me, and thanks to the State Bank of India for this opportunity to speak. I was actually going to change the very beginning here just to say it is a remarkable thing now. Thinking about all of the years that have worked on international trade, my recent visits to developing countries have been very different from what I used to do. When I was starting out on international trade, the first thing one would do is, first of all, you would only mostly visit emerging markets, what we now call emerging markets, when they were in trouble. I used to describe myself as an ambulance chaser. I would be going to countries that were having financial crises, but otherwise not so much. And second, you would be trying to make the case to countries that they should open themselves to the world market, that they should participate in the global economy. India, when I was a student, India was famously closed off to international trade. It was famously not a participant in the international economy. Now, of course, it very much is, and we have been living through an era of extraordinary increase in global integration, extraordinary increase in linkages among countries, which has created many opportunities, has created change for the world. But that era itself is now changing. And much of what I want to do in the course of the next 40 minutes or so is talk about how many of the assumptions that we have made that have been valid for the past generation or so are going to be decreasingly valid as we look forward, and they create some urgency, if I might say, about the task of getting on with economic development. I'm not capable of I wish I could speak like a politician and talk so glowingly about a new India, but in fact, the urgency of development is now greater because there is a window, and that window, I don't think it's closing, but it's getting narrower, and now is the time to take advantage of it. So let me tell you about, let me start with some very, very big, sort of grand sweep picture. So this is the history of the world. It is a, are we projecting? There we are. Okay, sorry. This is exports plus imports as a share of global GDP. So it's a measure of the total amount of trade in the world. And what you see in this, in case you're wondering, by the way, the reason there are the two colored lines is the data sources change, but they are, the splicing is good enough. What you see is that there have been now 4.5 eras. And the half I'll tell you about in a few minutes. There have been 4 eras of global trade. The first was an era, some of the founding monuments of the city date from that era, what we now often refer to as the first global economy, the era of railroads and steamships and telegraphs, which did tie the world together in a way that was very important, the era of the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal. Dramatic growth in world trade, dramatic increase in linkages among countries, large flows of people for the first time that created a global society in some ways as well as a global economy, which came to an end was disrupted severely by the First World War, and then was followed by a prolonged retreat from trade. The world was much less global in 1950 than it was in 1913. It was a much more dissociated world. Partly that was because of protectionism. It was because countries turned inward on themselves, restricted imports. Emerging markets pursued policies of inward-looking industrialization, but also even advanced countries had many restrictions in place. It was also because, in ways that I'll explain a little bit later, in fact, the movements in technology were not favorable for globalization. Technology continued to advance, but in ways that were actually unfavorable for large-scale international trade. Then came the process of rebuilding a global economy. The multilateralism, first the GATT, eventually the WTO, global trade agreements, major trade rounds, a long process of removing those barriers, extraordinary, really one of the extraordinary achievements, if I might say, of economic policy and diplomacy. It took a lot to get us to a world of where all of those tariff barriers that had been erected during the 1930s were gotten rid of, a world in which trade policy was set almost uniquely among major economic policies. Trade policy is a cooperative endeavor. It's something where what countries do is constrained by a set of rules. In effect, we have submitted ourselves to global rule of law on trade in a way that few other activities in the world are subjected to. It's from my point of view, a great achievement. It actually means that at this point, at this particular moment, if we look at policies that are detailed and complex, if you like, microeconomic policies, trade is perhaps the cleanest, the most absent, the one in which there's the least corruption, the least dominance of special interest politics, the greatest openness, because of this system. Not perfect, but it's actually remarkably good. The United States was at the center of this move towards creating a global system. One of the interesting questions now is how far will the United States be the agent of its destruction under current leadership? But we won't know the answer to that for a little while. Even so, despite all of that, it's a modern conceit that we tend to think that trade always grows, but in fact, of course, it shrank quite a lot after 1913. And even as of 1990, world trade was not dramatically different in intensity and scale from what it had been before World War I. All of the process, all of the rounds of international trade negotiation, all of that, in many ways, was only reconstructing the world of our great-grandfathers. Then something happened, and now we get to closer to contemporary events. Beginning around 1990, there is an extraordinary takeoff of international trade. This is the era of massive amounts of trade in manufactured goods. It's the era when developing countries are no longer simply industrializing to produce for their own markets, but are becoming part of global value chains. It's the era that inspired bestsellers like my colleague Tom Friedman at the New York Times, The World is Flat. It's the extraordinary expansion of global trade, and it is like nothing that we had ever seen before. It's also, it had very important influences, which I'll talk about in a second. If you look at the very end of this picture, you see something which will become much more apparent once I zoom in on it in a minute, which is that era has perhaps come to an end. By the way, the term hyperglobalization is Arvind Subramanian, advisor to the government now. I'm borrowing the term from him. What happened in this period of rapid growth? Well, we believe it was partly a change in policies. Developing countries, which had been inward-looking, shifted to outward-looking policies. You have major trade liberalization here. In Latin America, you have the opening of China to the world. But a lot of it also was that technology was probably moving in ways that were very favorable to globalization. Some of that was technology that is fancy. The internet does, in fact, make it possible to coordinate production over long distances. It makes it possible. We had effective instantaneous communication among countries in the 19th century already with submarine cables and telegraphs. But the old system was low bandwidth. You could communicate a message that said, sell, but you couldn't easily communicate complex information at speed across the world. Now you can. Individual mobility, the coming of widespread air travel made it possible to exchange information in person on a rapid basis, but also more prosaic things. The container, the box, was a tremendously important factor. Not so much the cost of shipping things as the cost of getting things off ships and onto other modes of transportation. And all of these things combined to produce a previously unprecedented rate of growth in international trade. What were the effects? Well, that's an interesting question, and not one where we're as sure as I would like to be. But what when we talk about international trade, there are the things that you can relatively easily measure, the things that leave a paper trail. Getting goods at lower cost, that's the main thing that effectively that international trade does. And when we can make some very, very rough estimates of those effects of international trade. And the best numbers that one can put, what was all of this hyperglobalization worth? Well, if we do that conventional analysis, if we say how much did that expand the world economy by allowing countries to specialize in the things that they were good at and therefore reducing costs, the answer is, well, something like 6%. That all of that rough doubling of the share of trade in world income between the 1980s and 2008 may have made the world about 6% richer than it would otherwise have been, which is not a trivial number. That's still quite a lot, but it's also not gigantic, and is probably, if that were all, we would not pay as much attention, I think, to globalization as we do. There is, however, pretty good reason to believe that the kind of globalization that took place in the era of hyperglobalization had much bigger indirect effects. Because this was not simply exchanging coal for wheat, or even exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials. This is global value chains. Reduced transportation costs, reduced transactions costs, increased ability to coordinate meant that global production processes could be divided among countries around the world, that pieces of a good could be shipped back and forth, and at least some economists, including some that I take very seriously, present persuasive evidence that this led to a widespread transfer of technology. The flow of information between countries increased dramatically as a result of the growth in trade. And that this produced an environment in which it became much more possible for countries for poor countries to grow rapidly and converge on rich countries. I mentioned I was reminiscing about the past and about international trade. When I was a graduate student, which is now a long time ago, I thought that I should go into development economics, which was obviously the most important subject. But I didn't because it was too depressing. Because in the 1970s, development economics was basically non-development economics. It was about why don't poor countries get rich. That was the way the world looked in the 1970s. It's not the way the world looks now. Obviously, we've seen many countries make dramatic economic progress. There's a nice summary of what has happened in the world that was created by my colleague at City University of New York, Branko Milanovic. Some of you may have seen it. He calls it the elephant curve. I don't quite see an elephant there, but anyway, he thinks it looks like an elephant. This is showing a picture of what's happening to income for the world as a whole. So not growth in income at different percentiles within a country, but taking the world and not among countries, but treating all of the population of the world. What has happened? What's happened to income of the median person in the world? What's happened to income of the person at the 80th percentile in the world? And what you see is, well, there's a far right part, which is the global 1% has seen a big increase in income, and that's an important issue for some context, but not what I'm going to talk about here. But what you see is the dramatic rise of incomes near maybe a little bit above, but in the vicinity of the middle of the global income distribution. And what we're talking about there is we are talking about the dramatic income growth in emerging markets. So this is Milanovic's version. He puts China's middle class there. But India would be a significant part of this as well, a little bit further down the curve. That's something new. This is, by the way, leave aside the global elite. This is a tremendous positive thing for the world. This is hundreds of millions, actually billions of people experiencing the chance of a better life in a way that was not available before. You might ask, doesn't it always look like this? And the answer is it does not. As best we can tell, this was not at all the pattern before about 1988, 1990. If we looked at growth over the 30 years before that, you would have seen slow growth at the bottom, slightly faster growth higher up the scale. You would have seen none of this surge of emerging markets. For a very, very, well, we used to. I can say that I got from my old teacher, Jagdish Bhagwati. He used to refer to India as having the Hindu rate of growth. So I'm quoting him. So the persistent 1% per year per capita GDP growth, which was very disappointing. Then everything changed, and we get this dramatic growth. Okay, so we have this era. We had an era from beginning late 1980s of hyperglobalization, which was transformative and very important, very exciting, has shaped how many people think about the world economy. However, nothing lasts forever. Let's try getting it. There we are. I'm going to grab a bottle of water. Pardon me. Okay. World trade dropped very sharply in the financial crisis of 2008. And then it bounced back, but it did not bounce back quite all of the way. And since now, this is the share of world GDP. So this is showing world trade in absolute terms. It has been growing, but it has actually been growing slightly more slowly than the world economy. We're not seeing a retreat from international trade, but we are seeing a plateau. It's really, for a couple of years, it was possible to argue that this was a temporary phenomenon. But at this point, we really are looking at about 10 years when you're not seeing a continuation. The data strongly suggest that hyperglobalization reached its limit, that hyperglobalization is a story about the past, not a story about the present, or rather the progress of hyperglobalization. Anecdotal evidence agrees with this. If we have many stories now of firms that extended their supply chains globally, and then at a certain point said, well, we've gone too far. In pursuit of lower labor costs, we have created logistics that are too difficult, too hard to manage, that we want to at least bring some of our production back to closer to markets so that we're able to respond to changes more easily. If some of that has involved return of small amounts of manufacturing to high-wage countries. One of the questions we've been asking in the United States is, we ask, where's the demand for labor? People talk about skills being in short supply, but where are the skilled workers who are seeing large wage increases? Well, it's quite rare, hard to find. But one skill that has seen large wage increases in recent years is skilled sewing machine operators. Because of some, not much, but some garment production has moved back to the United States as people retreat a little bit from hyperglobalization. And it turns out we have nobody who knows how to do that anymore. Nobody who knows how to produce apparel. So we have a shortage and rising wages for those skills. This is, we sometimes talk about reshoring of production. And there's been a little. It's not anyone who thought that we were going to see a collapse of global trade that's an exaggeration. That's a gross exaggeration. But we are seeing a plateauing of the process. Very little of it, at least so far, is the result of protectionism. Many people thought that the Great Recession might lead to a repeat of what happened in the Great Depression, when there was widespread protectionism. But that did not happen this time. The system actually held together. No country went on a full-scale return of tariffs. The WTO remained in place. The rules of the game remained robust through that. Again, we don't know what happens now. Okay, what did happen? Why did we see this change? I'm going to try to, I hope, may explain something which sometimes people find difficult. Certainly I did. I had this wrong initially, but I think it's quite important. Namely, technology is not enough. Think about how does technology affect global, the amount of international trade? How does productivity advance? How do new technologies affect the extent to which countries trade? And our normal tendency is to assume that it must lead to more trade. Technological progress, shipping becomes cheaper, ability to communicate becomes better, we abolish distance. But that's not actually right. Some kinds of technological progress are pro-trade, but others are anti-trade. The way I find useful to think about this, and this is just a very stylized example, is think about the choice between producing a good domestically or sourcing it from abroad. And this is a stylized picture which makes the it makes the transportation costs much bigger than visible transportation costs ever are, but it'll help me tell the story. Suppose they were indifferent, right on the margin. You could produce domestically, or you could get something that was produced abroad more cheaply, but then you have to transport it to the domestic market. Now imagine that you have, well, there's two kinds of technology here, right? There's a technology of production, and there's a technology of transportation. And either or both of those can make progress. In fact, both of them are always progressing, but they have very different effects. If you have a reduction in transportation costs, which is shown here, then it makes importing the good more attractive. So changes in the 19th century, the railroad and the steamship, and the telegraph, which was a way of coordinating activities. But essentially, the steam engine made transportation costs less and led to an increase in the share of trade in the world economy. In the post-1980s period of containerization, the internet made actually also cheaper air transport, made increased globalization possible. And so that's the obvious point. Technological progress in transport encourages trade. However, suppose that you have technological progress in production that is faster than the progress in transportation. Suppose that you have productivity growth in manufacturing, let's say, while the technology of transportation remains the same. By the way, that seems to have happened between the two world wars. We often attribute the decline in trade to protectionism, which was certainly part of the story. But one of the things that happened during that period was that there was dramatic progress in manufacturing coming of assembly line production, while the technology of transportation remained more or less static. It was still a world of steamships and railroads. Oops, I have to keep, there we go. Again, I made the numbers look exaggerated. But suppose that you have a situation in which you have no further improvement in transportation, but you have technology that reduces the amount of resources that are needed to produce things. then the relative cost of sourcing something from overseas becomes higher. And it actually discourages trade, becomes less likely. So that, suppose that let me tell you what I think is actually happening. What has actually happened is that the great revolutions in transportation and communication now lie in our past. We've containerized everything that should be containerized. We have learned how to use aircraft to ship things that require short delivery times. We have a global internet. All of that exists. We're continuing to make progress. So that technological revolution is behind us, but we're continuing, at least in some areas, to make progress. We're continuing to have robotics. There is some question why we don't see more of that technological progress in the productivity numbers, but we believe that we're seeing significant technological progress in making things, not so much in transporting them. And the result actually is that it becomes cheaper to start producing things close to markets again. That instead of outsourcing some piece of the value chain to Bangladesh or to India, you may end up having robots produce it in Ohio. And that's it seems to be a real phenomenon. One of the things that people have noticed when talking about reshoring, we do see some manufacturing come back to the United States or to Europe. Then people say, but we brought back the manufacturing production, but where are the jobs? You have a new plant, but it seems to be all robots, and it doesn't seem to be employing any workers. Yes, well, that's exactly why you're bringing the stuff back. It's the robots that are making it attractive to relocate production close to markets again. But for that same reason, the same thing that's making the production relocation attractive is also making it not so much of a source of jobs. And so that is I believe a key point now is that we are now seeing a phase in which the technological constellation that led to hyperglobalization has gone at least slightly into reverse, where the transportation revolution is behind us, the robotics revolution, if you like, is still happening. And so we're seeing some retreat from global trade. In a way, you can see this even more clearly if we look at the distinctive Indian characteristic in global trade. India has actually blazed a completely new path. Before the last couple of decades, actually, there was essentially no long-distance trade in services, because services had to be delivered face-to-face. And that ceased being true with telecommunications of various forms. But India is the first emerging market, first rapidly growing developing country to rely heavily upon exports of services. Of course, that's infamously, or just the cliche is the call centers, but there's much more to it than that. So India has become a service exporter. Well, you might say, well, what does this have to do with that? Well, the answer, which is actually, there have now been a number of recent studies saying that developments that are the equivalent for the information world of robots in the physical world are actually to at least putting some pressure on the ability to export services. So that, I'll just give you my my word slide. If you like, internet, telecommunications, fiber optic cables reduce the cost of transporting information and therefore services between countries, certain kinds of services. But now we have dramatic progress in the ability of machine learning, artificial intelligence to do some functions. And there are, at least in the specific case of the call center industry, there's now considerable concern that the advantages of globalization are diminished. The advantages of shifting your production activity to a developing country with lower wages are less than they were because you can now do a lot of these things without people at all. And so it works against the exports. There's nothing inherently wrong with these shifts. There's nothing that says that globalization, that trade is, at least in the textbook, trade is good to the extent that it makes sense from the point of view of the market. If you have a slowdown in trade because changing technology makes trade less attractive, then that's okay. That's what's supposed to happen. But there are some concerns about developing countries. If we believe that hyperglobalization was a key element in making possible real takeoff and growth in much of the emerging world, then we should be at least somewhat concerned that the tide is now running against that kind of economic progress, that the world is is going to become less favorable for rapid economic growth in emerging markets than it has been. Now, I don't want to overstate that case, but let me just put up the picture for this country, and then we can talk about it. So, this is a story I guess everyone here knows. This is real GDP per person in India as a percentage of real GDP in the United States. And for 40 years after independence, this was a disappointing story. The growth was positive but slow here. If anything, India fell slightly further behind the rich countries of the world, did not close the gap at all. And then, well, perhaps in the 80s, certainly by the 90s, something changed, and you see a dramatic acceleration. Now, of course, as in all countries that have seen economic takeoffs, there were policy reforms. Clearly, you have to give substantial credit for this economic turnaround to very, very big changes in policy. In some ways, despite all that still needs to be done here, since India had one of the most restrictive trade regimes in the world, the fact that it has opened itself up to the world as much as it has represents among the biggest trade policy changes ever. And there were also major changes, of course, on the domestic economy. So policy is part of it, but the kinds of gains that we see here are not explainable by the conventional stories about trade policy. Even the most enthusiastic free trader in 1980 would not have predicted that India would essentially triple its income relative to the advanced world as a result of trade policy reforms. And yet you did see it, and you see this takeoff. Now, the other thing to say is that India is not unique. Of course, China does even better for reasons that one can debate a great deal, but also other countries. I was struck, have been struck, actually I've been doing some work on Bangladesh, which is a country that almost nobody in the West, if I might say, has noticed, but has a country that has achieved a lot of progress. It's still desperately poor, but not nearly as desperately poor as it was. And again, it's very clearly tied to globalization. It's tied to the growth of the apparel industry, which is a piece of this rise of globalization. The question you want to ask is, where does this, is this an inexorable trend? What does we take? Obviously, 12% of US GDP per capita is not where you want to level off. 100% would be good, but what one wants to see, when people ask what should emerging markets want to want to become? And my actual answer usually is South Korea. If we want an example, there's a country that was desperately, desperately poor, was actually in the 1950s, I believe, would have been poorer than India, and has made it all the way now to full advanced country status. Doesn't mean make it a utopia, but that does show that it's possible. It was very, very much tied to integration in global value chains. But what if the global value chains have stopped growing? What if the incentives for that kind of growth are no longer, the technology is no longer going your way? What do you do then? And I think I need to qualify again. When I try to talk about these things, it sometimes sounds as if I'm saying that global trade is going to collapse. I don't think that's going to happen. There's certainly no reason to believe that we would see a dramatic reduction in global trade unless we have a political crisis. Now, of course, we could have the political crisis, and maybe I'll talk about. Actually, I'm going to change order here. I'm going to talk about that briefly in a few minutes. But leaving aside, what we're talking about instead is perhaps a gradual decline in growth of trade relative to world GDP. But more concretely, what we're talking about is that corporations producing for the global market, instead of looking for ways to push their production ever further out into a global arena, will start relocating parts of it back close towards markets, with the biggest markets being in the already wealthy countries. And that because they're no longer expanding, because they're no longer moving those value chains out further, because they're no longer slicing up production into smaller pieces so that there's a greater participation of the world, they are doing less foreign direct investment. They're doing less outreach of partnering with firms in developing countries, and they are therefore providing less transfer of know-how, of information, of ideas, so that the engine, the indirect effects of globalization that we think have done so much to promote rapid growth in poor countries will no longer continue to work in their favor. The wind, instead of being strongly at your back, will be at least slightly in your face as you try to move up this process. Now, this is only just beginning. If there is a turnaround in world trade, it is we're seeing a plateauing now. There are still plenty of opportunities, and there's still plenty of opportunities for countries that become more attractive as places to produce, to enlarge their own share of world trade, even as we look forward. But it may be getting harder over time. This is the sense in which I would argue that there is a window that will not close, but will get narrower. And you really want to try to take advantage of that window. You can't count, let's put it this way, the opportunity to follow in South Korea's footsteps or even China's footsteps may not be as great in 5 years, 10 years as it is now. It may be considerably less in 20 years than it is now. And so there is a window of opportunity that is getting, has stopped getting wider and may be getting narrower, and that creates some urgency about getting things right now. Okay, at this point I stop using, I'm just going to leave this chart up here, and I want to talk about what I have learned about India and the issues that seem to be relevant to this story. So, growth in India has been slow. The short run is actually it's a typical successful emerging market story, which is that you have numbers that growth numbers that an advanced, mature economy would die for, which are nonetheless actually kind of bad news, because you should be growing even faster than that. So we would have, if we had 6% growth in the United States, Donald Trump would declare himself emperor or something. But 6% growth in India is actually pretty disappointing. You probably should be doing 8 or 9. And so you see a slowdown in the short run. I don't think that has very much to do with these, with the phenomena I'm talking about. I look at India, and it looks as if it's conventional macroeconomic issues that are slowing the economy. You have the, if anybody wants to ask, but you have the very rather odd demonetization, which created some disruption. You have monetary policy that looks tighter than one can easily justify. I don't quite understand why it isn't looser. If we had the inflation performance, if an advanced country saw the trends in inflation that you're seeing here, you would be talking about substantial loosening of monetary policy. And a strong currency has inhibited some export sectors. So there's probably short-run macroeconomic issues. Let me also say that when I was approached to give this talk, I was asked to comment on fiscal spending. And I will say, I hope that people don't believe that because I was a strong advocate of fiscal stimulus in advanced countries in the aftermath of the financial crisis, that I believe that big spending and budget deficits are always a good idea. They're not. The point is you want them when you have a depressed economy and you have no traction with monetary policy. So that's not the story that one wants to tell here. However, when I read the IMF's most recent Article 4 consultation report on India, and I see a near obsessive focus on the budget balance, I wonder why is that the story? Why are we, that doesn't seem, the fiscal situation, yes, there are budget deficits, but if you have an economy which has some inflation and rapid underlying growth, moderate budget deficits are completely consistent with a stable ratio of debt to GDP, which has in fact been the case in India. And there doesn't seem to be a fiscal problem. I don't see that that's something that ought to be a focus. The real focus should be on things that expand growth. And of course, there's the usual things, which are still, however, profoundly important. There's investment in infrastructure. There's investment in education. There's investment in policies that improve nutrition, childcare. All of those things work for the longer run. Not being a business person, I can never really, if I want to say, I always feel a little bit like I have no business even talking about discussions that focus on ease of doing business, because what do I know about it? But it's certainly true that India, although it has improved on that, there's now widespread, there's still widespread sense that it's not as easy as it should be. We're no longer in the days of the license raj, but we're still in a situation where it's a little bit harder than it should be to get business done. All of which contributes probably to India not having benefited as much from hyperglobalization as it should have, not having managed to integrate itself into the international value chains the way it should have. And those things can still be fixed. The opportunities for participating are still there. But the message I want to convey is that now is the time to be doing them. That we still have a world economy that is relatively favorable for countries trying to break in, but it's getting slightly less favorable for countries trying to break into the club of advanced countries. It's going to be a long way before we get back to the situation where development seems like a very, very hard goal. But I do worry that countries that fail to make the most of this era will find that the next era is not nearly as good. If I were going to say, I worry quite a lot about the countries that really haven't even started on the process. India is not one of those countries, but it has those problems. Let me take a moment, since I said I would, to talk about about the possibility of something much worse happening. The big news for economic policy, for international economists last week was that, according to news reports, the US president, overruling almost his entire cabinet, has decided that we are going to go ahead and impose tariffs on steel. Now, that's only a report, based on sources. Nothing has happened yet, but that's what we're hearing anyway. And there's a real possibility that the United States, it would be pretty much crazy and irresponsible to really disrupt the world trading system and start a trade war, which, given current leadership in my country, means it's entirely possible. So that's something we should worry about. I think we should bear in mind that while there, in addition to the fundamentals that mean that the age of hyperglobalization is probably coming to a close, there's also a real possibility of future political disruptions. And not just because we happen to have a problematic individual in the White House, but because it's turned out that in advanced countries, political support for the whole international economic order is much shallower than anyone really understood. That the elite has gone for it, but it's not inevitable, and the general public has really never appreciated it, and it's not too hard to construct scenarios in which we do have a major relapse, in which, if we were to go back, I won't go all the way back to that first slide, but that interwar collapse of trade showed that the world doesn't always have to move towards greater integration, and it could happen again. Not prediction, but I think a substantial possibility. And if it does happen, what will happen? The richer the country is, the better it will be able to weather the storm. So you really, again, want to make your way up this slope, up that slope as now, while the climbing is still pretty good. My underlying message for people in business, I think, and so for policymakers, these are all the good things one should do. I'm not a business person, but I think you do need to have some sense of the environment. And the environment is this. If you look at the trends that dominated people's pictures of the global economy between 1990 and the global financial crisis, there's still a tendency to extrapolate, to say that, things will get ever more global, that the world will get ever flatter, that more and more production will be sourced, it will take the form of global value chains, and that it's just going to get more and more integrated. That is that's a story, that's already now a story that is in the past. It's not happening. There are some integration, there's still some things are getting outsourced, some things are getting reshored. The great era of global trade growth appears to be behind us. And it's going to be a difficult, countries are going to have to work harder to prove themselves, and businesses are going to have to work harder to prove themselves in this global marketplace, because this is looking now like a one-time event. And the next 20 years won't look like the last 25 years. There'll be a much more, at best, there'll be an environment in which growing trade is much harder than it was, and at worst, an era of major pulling back. Things change, and even the direction of change changes, and I think we're now at a great turning point away from the globalization that made so much of history after 1990. I hope that was a useful lesson, and I'm ready for questions and answers. Thank you.